Carl Jung identified 8 signs of an extremely rare personality type. And if you recognize even half of these characteristics in yourself, if even 4 of these 8 descriptions produce that specific and unmistakable quality of recognition that feels less like encountering new information and more like finally being given precise language for something you have always privately known about yourself, then you are part of what can genuinely and without any exaggeration be described as the psychological elite. Not in the sense of superiority over others, and not in any way that diminishes the value or the dignity of those who do not share these traits, but in the precise, technical, and clinically grounded sense that Jung intended when he identified individuals who have developed what he termed differentiated consciousness, a specific way of experiencing, processing, perceiving, and engaging with reality that the overwhelming majority of people never achieve, never develop, and in many cases never even encounter as a concept, let alone as a lived possibility. In his decades of meticulous, systematic, and deeply personal clinical research, Jung documented that fewer than 5% of the entire human population develops this particular form of consciousness, this quality of psychological depth, perceptual sophistication, emotional complexity, and interior architecture that distinguishes certain individuals from the collective patterns that govern most human experience at any given historical moment. 5%. Which means that if you are genuinely part of this group, the statistical reality of your experience is that the overwhelming majority of people you encounter throughout your life will not have the interior reference points to understand what you are experiencing, why you respond to the world the way you do, or why the things that seem self-evidently important to you are apparently invisible to the people standing immediately beside you. But here is what is most fascinating and most important about this discovery. The dimension of it that Jung found most disturbing and most urgent to address. These rare individuals, the very ones whose psychological architecture he identified as representing an advanced stage of human consciousness, almost universally spend significant and often devastating portions of their lives completely and genuinely convinced that something is fundamentally wrong with them. Not slightly off, not in need of minor adjustment, fundamentally, perhaps permanently, broken. Jung documented case after case of people with extraordinary psychological gifts, with emotional depth, perceptual sophistication, and interior complexity that represented the leading edge of human psychological development, who had been successfully and thoroughly persuaded by the culture surrounding them that their intensity, their sensitivity, their absolute refusal to accept shallow answers and superficial arrangements, their inability to pretend that small talk constituted meaningful communication, were character flaws requiring correction. Evidence of instability, signs of being, in the phrase that most of us in this particular psychological configuration have heard directed at us at some crucial and formative moment, simply too much. Society does not understand these individuals. It never has in any era. And its response to what it does not understand is entirely consistent and entirely predictable. It pathologizes it. It frames the difference as deficiency. It teaches the rare personality to see their greatest gifts as their worst liabilities. And so these individuals spend years, sometimes entire lifetimes, working to become smaller, quieter, less intense, more manageable, more convenient for a world that was built around a different and less demanding form of human consciousness. Jung's most genuinely revolutionary and shocking realization, the one that would reorganize significant portions of his theoretical framework as it developed through the middle period of his career, was that these rare personalities are not merely different from the majority in ways that are interesting but ultimately neutral in their significance. They are, in a demonstrable and historically consistent evolutionary sense, ahead of it. They represent a genuine direction in which human consciousness is developing, not a deviation from a norm that everyone else has successfully achieved, but a preview of what that norm is slowly, across generations and across centuries, in the process of becoming. Which means that everything society has told these individuals about themselves, all the criticism, all the pathologizing, all the demands to be less than they are, has been not only wrong, but precisely backwards. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Carl Jung. Your greatest and most beautiful journey is the one that leads you back to yourself. Subscribe to Carl Jung Philosophy and hit the like button, and let's walk that path together. The first sign of psychological rarity is that you experience emotional depth that feels almost supernatural in its intensity, its reach, its specificity, and its apparent disproportionality to the circumstances that triggered it. Jung discovered something in his clinical work that the majority of his contemporaries entirely missed, and that most contemporary therapeutic frameworks still fail to adequately integrate. That certain individuals do not merely feel emotions in the ordinary way that word is typically understood. They experience what he called affect-toned complexes, densely layered, intricately structured clusters of feeling, meaning, memory, archetypal resonance, and historical implication that create profound psychological vibrations extending far beyond the immediate stimulus that triggered them, and touching dimensions of human experience that most people have never consciously accessed. You do not simply have feelings in the way that most people understand that phrase. Feelings move through you like extraordinarily layered and complex compositions, symphonies rather than single notes, each one carrying dimensions of meaning and historical resonance and archetypal significance that others around you simply cannot access at comparable depth, with comparable richness, or with comparable sensitivity to the full range of what is actually present in any given moment of genuine emotional experience. When something touches you, it touches everything. When something moves you, it moves you in multiple simultaneous directions and at multiple simultaneous depths. When you feel grief, you feel not only your own grief, but the grief that lives in the situation itself, in the people nearby, in the historical and cultural context surrounding the moment. When you feel joy, you feel it with a quality of intensity and completeness that can make ordinary happiness seem to others like an entirely different emotional category. Jung understood, and this is the specific insight that most therapeutic frameworks still systematically fail to integrate, that this quality of emotional depth is not instability. It is not dysregulation. It is not a failure of appropriate emotional management. It is emotional sophistication operating at a level of development and complexity that the frameworks available to most clinicians and most cultural observers were simply not built to accommodate or even to recognize. When you feel deeply and with what appears from the outside to be disproportionate intensity about something that others respond to with mild interest or no discernible response at all, you are not overreacting to the surface circumstances of the situation. You are accessing what Jung called the objective psyche, the deeper, older, more richly textured layers of human experience that most people have been conditioned, often since the earliest years of childhood, to suppress, redirect, manage from a distance, or simply ignore in favor of the more socially convenient, surface-level response. You feel the unspoken tension operating in a room before anyone has said anything that would rationally justify the feeling to an external observer. You carry the emotional undercurrents of every significant interaction in your body for hours or days afterward, not because you cannot let go, but because your system genuinely absorbed the full emotional content of what occurred, rather than the filtered and reduced version that most people receive. You know when someone is suffering before they have given you any explicit reason to know. You feel the grief operating beneath performed cheerfulness, and the fear operating beneath performed confidence with a directness that bypasses conscious analysis entirely. This is not a problem to be solved, or a sensitivity to be gradually desensitized through therapeutic work. It is a capacity requiring understanding, protection, conscious management, and ultimately integration into a sustained and honest relationship with your own depth. Leave the number 111 in the comments. In the symbolic framework that Jung developed across his lifetime, 111 represents the awakening of individual consciousness beyond collective patterns. The moment a rare personality first genuinely recognizes that their emotional depth is not evidence of what is wrong with them, but evidence of what is most fundamentally and most powerfully right. If this description of emotional depth is naming something you have carried your entire life without an adequate and compassionate framework for understanding it, 111 is your signal. Leave it here. The second sign is what can only be called sacred curiosity, an absolute, constitutionally grounded, and entirely non-negotiable psychological inability to accept reality at its surface level. Not as a philosophical preference, not as an intellectual affectation, but as the direct expression of a psychological architecture that was built to perceive beneath surfaces and that cannot simply choose to stop doing so, any more than a person with acute hearing can choose to stop registering sounds that others cannot detect. Jung observed that the majority of people live what he called unconscious lives, accepting social programming, cultural assumptions, and received beliefs without subjecting any of them to examination of genuine depth or genuine honesty. They follow the established channels of collective existence with the reliability of water following a riverbed, never pausing to question the landscape that created those channels, never asking whether the landscape itself might be different or might need to be different. The maintenance of comfortable collective illusions is, for most people, not a choice made after consideration. It is a default that requires no effort because the alternatives require too much. But you cannot participate in this maintenance. Your psychological structure makes unreflective acceptance of received realities effectively and genuinely impossible for any sustained period. You do not merely ask what, you ask why. And then you ask why the why was constructed the way it was. And you follow the chain of questioning past the point of social comfort into the territory where genuinely useful answers sometimes begin to appear. Why do people remain in relationships that demonstrably and progressively diminish them year after year without engaging honestly with the question of what keeps them there? Why do entire cultures accept systems that demonstrably fail to serve human flourishing and frame that acceptance as maturity rather than resignation? Why does shallow conversation pass for meaningful connection in most social environments? And why does pointing this out produce the social response it does? Jung identified this relentless questioning as the transcendent function in its most active and most demanding form, the psychological capacity to hold the genuine tension between what is and what could be, between the current arrangements of collective life and the possibilities that those arrangements are actively suppressing or preventing, without collapsing prematurely into either the comfortable acceptance of the status quo or the ineffective despair of someone who sees the problem clearly but cannot locate the path forward. This function operates in you constantly and without your deliberate activation of it. It is not something you turn on. It is something that would take extraordinary and sustained effort to turn off, and even then would not stay off for long. Your questions do not threaten others' comfortable illusions by accident or through carelessness. They threaten them because that is precisely what genuine questions are designed to do, and what most of the people around you have organized their psychological lives to avoid experiencing. The third sign is individuated consciousness, a quality of genuine psychological independence that did not arrive as a philosophical choice made after reading the right books or encountering the right ideas, but as the hard, accumulated consequence of lived experience revealing repeatedly and without possibility of misinterpretation that organizing your sense of worth around others' perceptions of you is a form of psychological quicksand, that making your interior stability contingent on external validation creates a structure with no actual foundation, one that collapses reliably under exactly the pressures it was constructed to withstand. You learned this not once, but many times from multiple directions, until the lesson became genuinely unavoidable. Jung called the journey toward genuine interior authority individuation, the deepest, most demanding, and most necessary form of psychological development he identified across his entire clinical and theoretical career. He was entirely explicit that most people never complete this journey because it requires sustained and honest confrontation with what he called the shadow, all the dimensions of the self that social conditioning has taught the individual to exile from conscious awareness, to deny, to project onto others, or to manage from a careful distance rather than integrating with genuine honesty. The shadow contains not only what is actually negative, the impulses toward cruelty, the capacities for deception, the tendencies toward self-interest at others' expense, but also many things that are genuinely positive but were suppressed because they were threatening to the people responsible for the individual's early development. The anger that was not permitted, the ambition that was labeled as arrogance, the needs that were treated as burdens. All of this lives in the shadow, and all of it must be genuinely encountered before genuine individuation becomes possible. Your solitude is not loneliness in another costume. It is sanctuary, the specific and irreplaceable interior space in which the authentic self can be heard beneath all the accumulated roles, expectations, performances, and accommodations that collective life requires. In solitude, you remember who you are when you are not being shaped by others' responses to you. You hear what you actually think, as distinct from what you have been taught to think. You feel what you actually feel, as distinct from what you have concluded is appropriate to feel. And this capacity for genuine interior contact, this ability to find yourself reliably in the privacy of your own experience, is not a withdrawal from life. It is the foundation upon which any genuinely meaningful engagement with life must ultimately be built. Leave the number 444 in the comments. In the symbolic language informed by the multiple wisdom traditions that shaped Jung's understanding of psychological development, 444 represents the stable and enduring inner foundation, the architecture of genuine selfhood that rare personalities construct through the specific and often painful combination of depth, suffering, honest confrontation with shadow, and sustained commitment to authentic self-knowledge that the individuation process demands. If you recognize in your own life the movement from external dependency toward genuine interior authority, from performing acceptability toward inhabiting authenticity, 444 marks that recognition precisely and completely. The fourth sign is hyper-perceptive awareness, what Jung identified as intuition functioning as a fully differentiated, reliably operative, and genuinely sophisticated psychological function, rather than as the occasional and unreliable impression that most people experience intuition to be. Jung wrote with considerable emphasis that intuition is perception operating through the unconscious, the specific capacity to bring forth accurate readings of people, situations, dynamics, and possibilities through a process that operates at speeds and through channels entirely inaccessible to conscious analytical thought. This is not a mystical claim. It is a precise description of a psychological process in which the unconscious mind assembles and processes information gathered through channels that consciousness does not monitor. Micro-expressions, energetic qualities, subtle inconsistencies between verbal content and nonverbal communication. Pattern recognition, operating on data points too numerous and too rapid for conscious tracking. You do not merely observe people in the ordinary observational sense that phrase implies. You read what might accurately be called their psychological signatures, the patterns beneath the patterns that are visible to ordinary attention. The emotional states operating beneath the performed surface, the fears and needs and unresolved histories organizing their behavior from levels they may not themselves have consciously examined. You notice expressions that cross a face in fractions of a second and vanish before any observer relying on conscious perception could register them. You perceive shifts in the energetic quality of an interaction before anything has been said that would account for those shifts at the surface level. You hear what is not being spoken with a clarity and a specificity that can sometimes match or exceed your comprehension of what is being spoken, because what is not being said often carries more information than what is. Jung issued a warning about this particular gift that rare personalities ignore at consistent and significant cost to their well-being, one that becomes more urgent the more fully developed this capacity is. If you do not develop conscious and deliberate practices for protecting this sensitivity, it will exhaust you with a thoroughness that eventually compromises your capacity to function. You will become the unconscious emotional stabilizer, psychological regulator, and energetic container for every interaction you enter, absorbing material that was never yours to carry, managing atmospheres that were never your responsibility, processing others' unacknowledged emotional content at the expense of your own psychological resources. Learning to protect this gift is not a betrayal of it. It is the prerequisite for it remaining genuinely useful rather than becoming the primary mechanism of your own depletion. The fifth sign is the absolute and non-negotiable prioritization of meaning over every other available source of social reward, external validation, or conventional satisfaction. Jung discovered through sustained observation that certain personalities are not simply people who prefer meaningful work and authentic relationships to their more superficial alternatives as a matter of taste. They are individuals for whom the psyche itself, the deep, largely autonomous intelligence that organizes psychological experience from beneath conscious awareness, demands meaning as a fundamental and non-negotiable condition of functional existence, and rebels against its sustained absence through symptoms that no amount of external achievement, social recognition, or accumulated comfort can quiet or resolve. You have probably attempted at various points in your life to live for external validation, to follow the available cultural scripts, perform the expected roles, pursue the goals that the dominant narratives of your time and place identify as self-evidently worth pursuing. You have tried, with genuine effort and genuine goodwill toward yourself and the people around you, to be satisfied by what is presented as satisfying. Jung would have recognized the symptoms of this attempt with immediate and clinical precision. The hollow knowing that operates beneath whatever external success you managed to accumulate, the persistent, quiet, absolutely reliable sense that something essential in yourself is being consistently betrayed by the life you are performing. The desperation that lives beneath any performance of contentment and that surfaces most reliably in the quiet hours when social performance is no longer required. According to Jung, when a rare personality consistently lives against their psychological type, when they organize their existence around purposes that fail to align with their deepest nature, the psyche does not merely produce mild discomfort or vague dissatisfaction. It rebels through what he called neurotic symptoms that are entirely proportional to the degree of authentic self-betrayal